The discovery of more than 1,000 unmarked graves in Canada, most believed to belong to Indigenous children who attended residential schools, inspired nationwide calls for reconciliation over the summer. But on the federal campaign trail so far, the issue has faded to the background. Leah Gazan, a member of parliament from the city of Winnipeg, was driving home from Ottawa when she heard there had been a second discovery of unmarked graves in Western Canada. It was June. Weeks earlier, the remains of more than 200 people, mostly children, some as young as 3, had been found in the province of British Columbia. Now, 751 more graves have been discovered, the largest finding to date. In Saskatchewan, the 2 burial sites contain the remains of students of Canada's state and church-run residential school system, discoveries that shocked the country and triggered a national reckoning over residential schools. Back in Winnipeg, fighting the exhaustion and grief triggered by the second discovery, Ms. Gazan went for a run, taking her typical route over the Provencher Bridge. She found the bridge wrapped in orange ribbon, part of a cascade of makeshift memorials made by Canadians in the wake of the findings. Ms. Gazan, a member of Wood Mountain Lakota Nation, ran her fingers along the fabric, moved by the show of support.
To date, more than 1,300 unmarked graves have been found in Western Canada near the grounds of former residential schools. Flags have been lowered to half-mast since the summer and statues of famous Canadians connected to the residential schools have been toppled. But on the national campaign trail, attention has been diverted away from the subject onto issues like cost of living, housing and childcare. It seems out of step with Canadian voters, among whom support for reconciliation, repairing the relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people and government, is at a recent high. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called the snap election in mid-August, 1 in 5 Canadians included reconciliation as a top 5 issue, double the figure from the 2019 federal election, according to polling from Canada.It data. Coming on the heels of the discovery of those unmarked graves really put a focus on this issue in a way people haven't before, said Abacus Chief Executive David Coletto. It's higher on the agenda than it's been in a long time. Internal polling by the Assembly of First Nations, a national advocacy group representing First Nation citizens in Canada, found that more than 60% of Canadians believe that Indigenous issues are priority for the ongoing election. Most Canadians are willing to move forward, we just lack political will, Ms. Gazan said. The former teacher and community organiser represents one of the poorest ridings in the country. She has pushed for a guaranteed basic income and affordable housing. But this time, she said, reconciliation is front and centre. In their platforms, all of Canada's major national parties have made wide-reaching commitments to Indigenous people. In 2015, Mr. Trudeau's first successful bid for Prime Minister, the Liberal leader benefited from an historic increase in turnout on Indigenous reserves, 61.5%, up nearly 15 points from the previous election. In December of that year, the landmark Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was released. It detailed decades of abuse toward Indigenous people in the country, including sweeping failures in the care of children forced to attend residential schools, amounting to cultural genocide. Mr. Trudeau had vowed full reconciliation, including the implementation of all 94 of the TRC report's calls to action. After 6 years under a Liberal government, 13 of the projects have been completed, with 29 projects underway, according to a running tally by CBC News. 32 are at the proposal stage and 20 have not been started at all. There is growing frustration at the pace, despite Mr. Trudeau's continued calls for patience. You can't piecemeal this thing, said Nigard Sinclair, a professor of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. Mr. Sinclair, who is Anishinaabe, compared the Liberals' progress to changing the drapes on a rundown home. They just try to make the house shinier, but the foundation is still broken, he said. In his first election as Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole has also made sweeping promises to Indigenous communities, emphasising plans for improved economic partnerships. Mr. O'Toole, who is neck and neck with Mr. Trudeau in the polls, has also pledged $1 billion to boost funding for Indigenous mental health and drug treatment programs. Mr. O'Toole has also said he supports the Northern Gateway Pipeline project, which was cancelled in 2016 by court order over lack of consultation with First Nations. Though some First Nations support the project, Others have objected over environmental concerns. And some critics have said his pledge to increase punishment for those who protest pipelines and other key infrastructure will unfairly target Indigenous activists. It just seems like a thinly veiled attack on Indigenous people, said Kathy Walker, a professor of political science at the University of Saskatchewan. Canada's left-wing New Democratic Party, led by Jagmeet Singh, has earned praise from Indigenous leaders for its platform, including a pledge to advance Indigenous self-determination and immediately end all drinking water advisories. The Trudeau government says it has lifted 101 long-term advisories but failed to meet its 2015 campaign promise to lift them all by March 2021. But influence in Parliament will be limited for the NDP, a party currently hovering at around 19% in the polls. The NDP are the most progressive party in the country, but they're never going to form government, Mr. Sinclair said. At a recent campaign stop in a majority Indigenous riding in Winnipeg, 2 First Nations stood next to Mr. Singh and thanked him for organising the event, dedicated to issues facing Indigenous communities, before endorsing the Liberal candidate, Shirley Robinson, of Pinisikamak Cree Nation instead of the non-Indigenous NDP candidate. But Ms. Gazan, a member of the NDP, said, "I don't want people to elect me because I'm Indigenous, I want people to elect me for what I stand for." Still, her priorities, addressing violence against women and girls, solutions for housing security and climate change, are those shared by many Indigenous groups. In this election, perhaps the clearest sign of progress for the advancement of Indigenous issues lies with the contenders. A record 77 Indigenous candidates are running in this election, according to analysis by the Canadian press, up from 72 in 2019.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.